Hey everyone, welcome back. As the US debt ceiling crisis continues to evolve, I got a question from a viewer asking if Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, which governs the validity of US government debt, could be used to force Congress to raise the debt ceiling. And I've seen some discussion popping up online regarding this issue, so let's sit down, go through the text of the amendment, the context it was originally written in, and then let's see how it might apply to our current situation. To make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm just going to go ahead and read Section 4 in its entirety. The validity of the public debt of the United States, authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. But neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave, but all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. So, why was this section added to the 14th Amendment? Well, the Civil War, like many wars, was expensive, and over the course of the war, both the Confederate and Union governments incurred a lot of debts and financial obligations. They issued bonds to raise money, they borrowed money from foreign governments, and they agreed to pay pensions to soldiers and a bunch of other things. So, in the aftermath of the war, when the Confederacy no longer existed, people started asking, well, who's going to pay all of the debts and obligations that the Confederate government had? And so this section was added to the 14th Amendment so that the U.S. federal government could say, well, while we authorized payments for our side of the war, we did not authorize any of the Confederate spending, so we don't know whose debt it is because it certainly isn't ours. And additionally, after slavery was outlawed in the 13th Amendment, the portion of this amendment that deals with slavery was added so that the Union government wouldn't have to compensate slaveholders for freeing their slaves. And that's really it. This amendment just said that the U.S. debt incurred over the course of the war was valid. The Confederate debt was not, and the U.S. government would not be paying any Confederate debts or obligations. So, how does Section 4 apply to our current situation? Well, there are many scholars who argue that since Section 4 requires the U.S. to acknowledge its debt as valid, that it also requires that those debts be paid. And yes, I think that the U.S. should pay its debts, but I do think there is also a distinction between a debt being valid and a debt being paid. One example of this from the U.S. legal system is, of course, bankruptcy. Let's say that you've racked up a ton of debt that you end up not being able to pay for whatever reason. You declare bankruptcy, and over the course of the proceedings, some or all of that debt may be eliminated. Now, obviously, the U.S. government can't declare bankruptcy, but the debt ceiling laws that are currently in place prohibit the Treasury from actually paying debts once it reaches a certain point. And the federal government really can't do very much without authorization from Congress. So, essentially, the Treasury's hands are tied. They're still going to acknowledge that the debt they owe to various creditors is valid, but they're essentially saying that, well, Congress has not authorized to pay you any money. We're actually currently in that situation right now, but some sneaky accounting tricks are being used to essentially allow the Treasury to still pay debts by moving some money around, but at the end of the day, there's a limit to what they can do without Congress authorizing more money to be spent, either by raising the debt ceiling, allocating taxpayer funds, raising taxes, whatever. But, again, the debt is still valid. The U.S. government acknowledges that it owes the money, but it simply doesn't have a mechanism to pay right now. And that would eventually lead to default. And again, default is just not paying the bills. So if Congress doesn't authorize the Treasury to pay the bills, there's not a whole lot the Treasury can do. Now, of course, this is just my interpretation. There are certainly others out there, but I think the bigger point here is that we don't ever want to find out who's right. And that's because in order to get a Supreme Court ruling on the matter to actually establish precedent regarding Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, the U.S. would have to default on its debt. When you try and sue to declare a law unconstitutional, which is what would have to happen with the debt ceiling, somebody has to suffer an actual injury. And the only injury that could happen here is someone not getting paid because the U.S. defaults on its debt. And if the U.S. defaults on its debt, that would amount to a global economic catastrophe. So that is something we definitely don't want to see, but it's also the only way to know who's right. So at the end of the day, I think it would just be better for everyone if Congress just raised the debt ceiling, and we didn't actually have to find out how the 14th Amendment's Section 4 applies to the U.S. national debt. Think about it.